Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. So, we're back after too long of a hiatus, I think, for another episode of Strange as It Seems. As usual, real life gets in the way of production schedule, but we'll try to get things back into some kind of, a bi-monthly track as we possibly can, but things will appear as they appear. Good things come to those who wait.
Well, I want to keep on a good production track, but part of that is my fault. I was hoofing up and down the highway for work, so.
No, and I took off on my own self-indulgent vacation, but that's the way that's what I mean by the real life comes in. So what we're going to be talking about today is it's a topic that comes up fairly often, gets a lot of mention and discussion, never gets quite the discussion I think it deserves. So we're going to try to maybe correct that a little bit today. And it is the infamous Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. A work which has been termed the most insidious piece of propaganda which has ever been produced, the most harmful work. It's hard to call it a book because this is more of a pamphlet length type of publication, but it's the most destructive work of the 20th century. That's all saying a lot, but much comes. It's not without reason. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, for anybody who hasn't already caught on to that, is an alleged blueprint for the creation of Jewish world domination. So, if you've ever run across this reference of some sort of Jewish world plot, or that Jews are going to run the world or have some plan to do so, it's an idea which has had some currency in the Third Reich and elsewhere in many other places, among people like not just Adolf Hitler, but Henry Ford. This is the documentary basis for this, however fallacious it may be, however dubious its creation. The work essentially came into being in the early 20th century. We'll describe that process because that's interesting. The main thing is we don't know originally where it came from. So it's like a lot of things that we talk about here. It appears. It is, again, the proverbial turd on a plate. So the protocols as a document exist. They first come into visible form in 1903. Within a decade of that, they proliferate. It's almost as if it almost becomes like a virus which begins to mutate. And so the protocols, let's start with what the protocols are supposed to be. What are the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion? Well, we'll leave aside who are the Learned Elders of Zion.
Yeah.
Supposedly, the idea here is that those are the leaders of this, some sort of one world, happy Jewish cabal, which is seeking domination. Protocols are minutes, basically, of a meeting or a summary of a meeting which has taken place. In some way, interrogations create protocols, a written record of what was said or what was discussed. Now, that's an interesting thing to keep in mind because as a written record of a meeting, they leave quite a bit to be desired. I mean, one of the first questions we'll come back to is if you actually were going to have a meeting for world domination, why would you keep written notes? Okay. there's not so much here that people just couldn't keep in mind, but also because it's written notes, they really don't describe too much. Instead, what it actually reads like is that it reads like a script for a Bond villain to explain to James Bond as they hold him captive what their evil plan is. This is the type of thing that you see villains do in movies. They don't do this in real life. They do it in movies. So the audience can figure out what it is they're going to do. Well, Mr. Bond, here's our whole plan, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. Dr. Evil always has some sort of plan that he just loves telling you about, and that's the way these things read. So, the thing about the protocols is that there are a set of sort of talking points, or each protocol is a slightly different topic. And one of the interesting things you find is that as the protocols evolve, the number of protocols within the document begins to change. So the first iteration, I think, has 22 protocols. But then soon thereafter, you get two different versions. One has 24 and one has 27. So the one that you will find most commonly today are the 24 protocol version. But it varies. And again, if it's a single document, why would it vary? If it's an actual transcript of what was said at a meeting, you should have that many. Now, the reason you get different protocols is that sometimes things are added. More often, a particular point is just divided into 2 points, or another ones are added together. So just keep in mind that it's a very odd description, a very odd thing to be the minutes of a meeting, since the number of minutes keep changing. But what I have here is a little sort of cheat sheet on the 24 protocol version. And I'm going to go through and give just a kind of brief description of what the protocols say. Because, well, one might realize that this is supposed to be a plot outline for Jewish world domination. Well, what is it actually saying? What do they lay out? What's the master plan? So protocol number 1 basically deals with the basic doctrine. Okay, the basic doctrine is that the political has nothing to do with the moral. So politics are completely separate from morality. Is that a surprise? Okay, but I think you would pretty much get the same answer elsewhere. That politics can play with morality, it can invoke morality, but politics is fundamentally immoral. Particularly if you conceive politics simply as the pursuit of power. The other point is that bad men outnumber good, so our policies must appeal to the bad. Just very simple. Appeal to baser motivations in people, because that there's a large constituency out there. Now, one of the things that strikes me interesting about that is that somewhere in the recesses of my memory, I'm pretty sure I've seen that somewhere else, and it wasn't in another version of the protocols. I think that Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the, again, very real Bavarian Illuminati back in the 18th century, said something very similar. So I find it kind of interesting that would show up here. Next point is use liberty, equality, and fraternity to incite disobedience and civil unrest. These are the type of things that you would focus on grievances among different groups, those seeking equality, liberty, or brotherhood. These are all terms that you can use to arouse people's passions. The interesting thing about liberté, equalité, and fraternité is that, yes, it is the motto of the French Revolution, but before that, it was the motto of French Freemasonry, especially Grand Orient Freemasonry. I think perhaps specifically of the Nine Sisters Lodge, but the catchphrase of the French Revolution began as a Masonic catchphrase, which would suggest a number of interesting things going on. Now, you're going to do all of this to undermine true liberty with false liberty. I don't know exactly what that means. It may mean something along the lines of you're going to, it's the idea is that there are different types of freedom. There's the freedom to, and there's the freedom from. And those can often be very contradictory. there are people who argue that it is a fundamental freedom to be able to possess firearms. There are others who believe that it is a fundamental freedom not to be surrounded by scary people who have scary firearms. Mm-hmm. That's something should be, those are the freedom to and the freedom from. But the last thing you actually want in all of this is for anybody to actually have real liberty. Maybe a promise of it, because you remember you're headed towards what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is the establishment of a universal despotic regime. Simply put, a one world order. Protocol 2 says wage economic warfare against the Gentiles. Now remember, this is a view which basically argues that there are two types of people in the world: Jews and everybody else. That's what Gentiles, or sometimes the term Goyim, can be used to describe. It's an extremely broad category. So wage economic war against everybody else, destroy their wealth, use destructive education to deceive and demoralize them. Got a problem with public education? Well, see how notice all the little buzz points this is going to touch upon. Protocol number 3, poverty is a useful weapon. Incite the poor against the rich. Very easy to do. Create and spread communism, which in some of the protocols is actually described as social masonry. Wow. I don't know how Freemasons would feel about that, but whoever putting this... Now remember, what we're looking at here it has nothing to do with what this is, anybody vaguely Jewish any description is actually saying. Or that even anti-Jews, that term that we like to call anti-Semites, because we're somehow pretending that we're not really talking about Jews when we are, right. That's a part, but someone created this. This is the key point to keep in mind. The document is real. And whoever it was, someone put this together. Now, whether this was to actually outline some plan for Jewish world domination, which seems kind of a stupid way to do it, or whether this was to simply create the idea that there is one, that is, it's actually an attack upon Jews and also upon Freemasons. Someone had to think this up. These are all creations of one or more human minds, and they did this with a purpose. So one of the things we're going to be trying to look at in this episode is to what the actual purpose of this document is. Protocol number 4, pretty simple: destroy faith in God. That is, undermine all traditional religions. Also, very much Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati wanted to do the same thing, and replace faith in God and religion with materialism. Just get people into the habit of, I don't know, make them all obsessed about buying a bunch of stuff they don't need on Black Friday, Protocol number 5, create and control monopoly capitalism. Didn't you say before that we're going to create and spread communism? Yeah, that's right. and now we're going to create and control monopoly capitalism, because we're going to control both ends of the spectrum. Yeah. We get you going and coming. Communism will save you from the capitalists. Capitalism will save you from the communists. Either way, we're running things. And protocol number 6, gradually reduce the Gentiles to slavery through these means. Now, protocol number 7, incite and profit from wars. Wars are very profitable. Somebody always makes a credible amount of money off of this. Again, fairly obvious, but this is a way to kind of earn money. But while we're creating communism and capitalism, we'll be inciting wars. Protocol number 8, control all sources of economic information and manipulate it to our ends. So, buy the Wall Street Journal. Control the Economist. That is, manage all of the alchemy of finance. Protocol number 9, our ultimate goal, just to state it again, is a one-world Jewish superstate. Protocol number 10, advance our influence by spreading the poison of liberalism, raise and manipulate puppet rulers. Again, I don't know specifically how you would want to define the poison of liberalism. I'm sure some people could probably do that, but simply it's mentioned here. these terms are used. Protocol number 11, we must be as wolves and the Gentiles are our sheep. Seems an odd thing to include, but nevertheless. Protocol number 12, gain control of the press. Make sure only our truth is presented. Well, everybody's warning you that it's all false news except it's on our channel. So, that doesn't seem to be too surprising. Again, keep in mind, this is a creation from around the beginning of the 20th century. That's when all of this was put together. So that's perhaps prescient. Maybe not. Protocol number 13, gain control of the workers' movements to deceive and manipulate them. That seems to go hand in hand with creating communism. Protocol 14, outlaw Christianity and Islam. So you've already destroyed religion and replaced it with materialism, and now you're going to outlaw it outright. Maybe these are sort of gradual steps. Protocol 15, use secret societies to spread our power and control Gentile cattle. That is a kind of watered-down reference to something that's stronger in the earlier version of the protocols, which is the Masonic angle. In fact, there's an interesting transition. The first iteration of the protocols in 1903 describes essentially a Masonic Judeo plot. The Masons get top billing. As different versions emerge, as the document evolves or mutates, the Jewish angle becomes more prominent, and therefore the references to Masons decrease, the references to Jews increases. But they're both there. There's always this kind of mention of both of them. Protocol number 16, rewrite history to serve our ends and brainwash the Gentiles. I guess that gets into the whole kind of infiltration of academia and, people like you and I. So, and then number 17, destroy the clergy, promote religious conflict and schism. They just really have a whole thing about religion here. We're going to destroy religion. We're going to outlaw Christianity. We're going to destroy the clergy. Note that much of this seems to be, wouldn't you say, slightly repetitive? Wouldn't that be kind of assumed that if you're going to destroy religion, that you're going to get rid of the clergy? Protocol number 18, create a police state and rule by fear.
Okay.
Practical advice. Protocol 19, suppress and criminalize the speech and thoughts of our opponents.
Okay.
You got a secret police, you can do that. And Protocol 20, destroy Gentile wealth, which I thought you'd already done.
There's a few.
Didn't we just talk about that? Gradually reduce the Gentiles to slavery. Anyway.
I was just, I would appreciate some order to this, at least, first you gotta, you're going to have your super state. Well, first let's suppress with.
You see what I mean? Is this a coherent blueprint? I mean, there are different elements that make sense, but if you're talking about a point by point incremental plan. No, it's kind of shotgun and repetitive.
I imagine a lot of guys sitting around and be like, we should do this.
Okay. And again, to destroy Gentile wealth, cause depression and panics. You're already doing that. Drive governments to bankruptcy through usury. Well, again, I thought we were already there.
They do that.
Protocol 21, gain control of all banks and credits. Control the money supply. What? Weren't you just doing? Okay. Again, that seems should have been a few protocols up. And then protocol number 20, to follow this whole trend, control gold. And then protocol 23, finally, establish a one world government under the divine leadership of the house of David. Now, this is one of the things that's pretty consistent. That ultimately, you're going to have an heir to the house of David sitting upon a throne of the world. That is, you're not simply going to create some kind of Jewish rule superstate. You're going to create a divine monarchy under a divine dynasty. And then protocol number 24 is that, this person will be the absolute power of the king of the Jews.
I mean, a lot of this sounds like apocalyptic kind of, now it gets pegged on Christian nationalists or Christian Zionists, I think, but like the kind of, in order for Jesus to come back, you have to have, right?
Aren't they describing Jesus?
Yeah, that's kind of what
isn't that kind of, you're talking about one world government under the divine leadership of the house of David.
Well, I've heard the argument made that the Antichrist is the one world government, and you have to have the Antichrist to have the Messiah.
He's going to come back.
It just all sounds similar to
Jesus was the king of the Jews, so
don't tell Jews
kind
that.
of, sort of. Right. I mean, but see, this is the odd thing. King of the Jews. I'm not sure what Jews would ever use that term.
Yeah, true.
We need a rabbi to come in here and talk about this. But I think the whole concept of King of the Jews,
that's a negative
isn't really. I mean, Solomon, yes, and some of the others, but the whole Jewish, the whole Hebrew monarchy thing didn't really work out that well.
I've always heard Messiah, right? The Messiah is going to come back.
Yeah, but he's divine, but he's the Messiah. He's not just a king.
Right. Yeah.
He's not just at least that's my understanding. King of the Jews is a term largely used by Christians to refer to Jesus.
Yeah.
Or it was a term, I would say, or a term used by the Romans to refer to him. But it's a term most commonly attached to him.
Right.
Okay. I don't want to say what most Christians believe because there's too many different versions of that. But it's a term you most often see in a Christian context, not in a Jewish context. And if one ultimately wanted to believe that Christ will return and reign over earth effectively as its divine king, that would be the absolute power established under a member of the House of David, among other things. So there is a kind of peculiar Christian context to things that are supposed to be a Judaic or a Masonic Judaic conspiracy. So that roughly, and again, the protocols, they're different versions. These are just very brief summaries of what they're saying. You see some go into greater detail, some are shorter, but that's essentially what the plan is. Those are the protocols. These are the essence of the supposed notes of a meeting which took place and in which this plan for world domination was elaborated. And I would simply say that as a plan for world domination, it is, highly aspirational, but it's really misses a lot of details, and it appears to be redundant in many cases, and never explains exactly the details of how this would be done, which means then why write it down to begin with? Nevertheless, you can read so many things into it. Notice the things that we're already reading into it. Okay, so I come back to the essential point. Someone put this together. It is the creation of one or more human minds for a particular purpose. So if you're curious about the protocols, if you've ever read anything about them, the most commonly accepted origin story usually runs this way. And it's traceable back to a 1967 book by a British historian, Norman Cohn, Cohn, called Warrant for Genocide. So Norman Cohn was a British historian. His father was of German Jewish background. His mother was an English Catholic. Make of that what you will. So he had an interesting perspective on this type of thing. But he became interested in his historical studies basically on the roots of extremism, as to why people would be attracted to, this is still an interesting idea, why are people attracted to what we term extremist ideas, which are things that are just way beyond what we would accept. And he thought that the protocols, because of their influence on their sort of justification and even fueling of anti-Semitism in the 20th century, that they were a product of this, that they were essentially a product of extremist propaganda. So he was interested in getting at the root of it. And he did some research, and he came across the particular story, a version, a 1921 account by a woman by the name of Katherine Rodzville. So here again, it's worth getting a little chronology in here, keeping things in order. So as I'll say more about, briefly, the first written appearance of the protocols, their kind of form, the first one, is in 1903 in Russia, in a newspaper, not in a book, not as a pamphlet, but as a series of serialized articles in a minor right-wing newspaper.
Mm.
A newspaper called Znamya, means banner. And it was essentially a newspaper representing what could be called the kind of Black Hundreds sentiment in Russia, which were the Black Hundreds is a kind of blanket term for people who were fanatical monarchists.
Right.
They were people who believed in the divine basis and mission of the Romanov dynasty, and were, of course, opposed to anything that could threaten that, especially revolutions, which many in the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds also were quite openly anti-Jewish. They often supported and encouraged pogroms, that is sort of race riots against Jews in Russia. They had a thing about Jews, okay? And they professed themselves as being absolutely loyal to the principles of an absolute monarchy and absolutely opposed to anything that threatened that. But they weren't a major political force. So the protocols first appear in 1903 in a minor right-wing newspaper in St. Petersburg, Russia. And they're also quite clearly billed as a Masonic Masonic Judeo plot, Jewish plot, as opposed to a Judeo-Masonic plot. So, but that's not the story that Norman Cohn tells in Warrant for Genocide, because when he wrote the book in 1967, the whole appearance of the first protocols in Znamya in 1903 wasn't known. That only came out much later. And the basic reason for that is it's often much more difficult to find things that appeared in an obscure newspaper because books are easier to trace. People follow bibliographies. You can follow the publications and editions of a book. Something that ran once in an obscure newspaper in a brief period of time, that might be lost forever. But fortunately, those were preserved. But it will change the whole narrative. So Norman Cohn's 1967 Warrant for Genocide basically takes a story that emerges in 1921. But we'll see in 1920 and 1921, there'll be all kinds of different stories and bits and pieces of stories emerging about the protocols. And the source of this story is a woman by the name of Katherine Rodzville, a woman of more or less Polish origin, spent much of her life living in France. Katherine Rodzville was a woman who moved in different levels of high society, or at least really close to it. She was basically a con woman. Okay. The more generous might argue she was a fantasist. That term you use to describe liars who somehow don't actually know they're lying. No, she's not a liar. She's a fantasist. She's a liar.
She's a good liar.
All right. Yeah, but she gets so caught up in her lies and they're so cool that she really begins to believe. I guess the argument is if you're a liar and you begin to believe your own lies, you become a fantasist.
Okay.
But I don't think that's what she was. I think she was actually involved in some plot to con Cecil Rhodes.
Oh, really?
She's a con artist.
Interesting.
I think she was trying to get him to marry her. There's a whole other story there that I don't remember that clearly right now, so I don't want to go too far.
We should do an episode on Cecil Rhodes.
On Cecil Rhodes.
Yeah.
She would come out. But she's a peddler of gossip. That's how one of the things she would go to newspapers. This is why she was acquainted with people in the press. It's because she would go to them and she would sell them, bits of salacious gossip, some of which were quite true. Who was screwing who, what was going on here, but she would also just make things up.
Yeah.
So she is unreliable. And she's also demonstrably she will do this for money. And she was paid for what she said in 1921. So she was asked, she said, look, I know where these protocols were created. There was already talk about them. I've got the real story. And I think it was an American publication, the American Hebrew, who actually said, and Jews were very interested, as you might assume, in discrediting this.
Yeah.
Because this was, you take it either way, either because it was true or false. It was very troublesome. So anything that would help sort of put a stake in this monster's heart and make it go away. And she comes forward with a story that I can explain how the whole thing were forgery because I saw it actually being forged. So what she describes, her story goes, is that it was in 1904 or 1905 in Paris. And she's invited by a fellow by the name of Matvey Golovinsky to sort of accompany him to his apartment. She's invited to his apartment, and she finds Golovinsky and another Russian, a fellow by the name of Peter or Pyotr Rachkovsky, and they're involved. They're all huddled over this table, and Rachkovsky is kind of looking over his shoulder, and what Golovinsky is doing is he's copying things he's got like a book over here, and he's reading it, and he's copying it into another notebook. And she even remembers that the pages in the notebook he was copying it into were yellow, and that there was a blue ink stain on the cover. Little details you might assume would suggest she was telling the truth. I would warn you that those are the little details that very clever liars will include to make it look, it's just kind of inconsequential, but, I think it was a spiral notebook. Yeah, that's what it was. See, I remember all of these things. Don't trust that. Okay. The little details are just there to add some kind of, to make a false story appear more believable, because those details are embedded in it. So what it would emerge is that what was actually going on here is that Golovinsky, she says, was copying from an 1865 document called The Dialogue in Hell Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. So we'll go to, Machiavelli, Renaissance Italian with either good or bad political advice, depending on how you feel about it. And then Montesquieu, a French Enlightenment philosopher, and they're in hell. And what they're talking about in this, just to keep it very briefly, is that what they're talking about has nothing to do with Jews or Jewish conspiracy. There's no mention of that in that book. It is a book written in the 1860s as a political attack on the then ruler of France, Napoleon III. The real Napoleon's ne'er-do-well, warmongering nephew. And the fellow who wrote this was a French lawyer, basically, and also would-be politician by the name of Maurice Joly, Joly. And he wrote it as a political statement in the 1860s attacking Napoleon III. But again, there's nothing, this is not a protocol. It bears no organizational resemblance to it. But what we will find later on, what it was that Rodzville was basing her whole story on, is that it had been recently revealed by someone else, a British reporter by the name of Robert Graves, I think. He was the one who had discovered that if you examine the text of the protocols carefully, particularly if you translated them back into French, and then compared them to Joly's dialogue, we'll call it that there were parts of it that were the same. There were parts of it that read almost the same, so that it was apparent that significant parts of the protocols were apparently identical to this 1860s political tract written by Maurice Joly. So Rodzville now comes forward with her story to explain how this came to being. So you got Golovinsky and you got Rachkovsky, and they're sitting in this room and they're copying from Joly's book apparently and onto another notebook, and that will become the protocols. Okay. Now, it's a story, right? And one of the things that I've mentioned before, and I'm going to mention again, probably will, is this whole thing about history is a narrative, or it's a set of competing narratives. So we go back that we often have, when it comes to historical events, very few firm facts. Very often we're simply confronted with the fact, again, what I call a turd on a plate, that the thing exists. You don't know why it's there. You don't know where it comes from. You're not even sure what it's supposed to mean, but it exists. That, again, is the protocols. The document exists. It's not fantastic. And that document does, as we'll say a little bit more about, includes significant, about 40% of the text of the protocols, depending upon what version you're using, because it varies, but, around 40% of it can be seen to be lifted from Joly's. Again, his isn't really a book either, but more of a political pamphlet, his dialogue in hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. But not just copied. It isn't. What you can imagine is that someone just sat down and they just like put another title on the dialogues. That's not what happened, because that 40% of the protocol's texts, roughly, that can be attributed to the dialogues is just scattered throughout them. There are some, I went through and tried to count it up. There's something like 300 different bits and pieces. And some of those can be a phrase, some of them can be a paragraph, some of them could be a sentence. So it's not as if you're just renaming one document after another. It's as if you're mining the dialogue for text that's then being embedded in a completely different kind of document.
Like legitimacy or a structure in some ways that makes it sound closer.
It could be, or you're just too lazy to come up with these things on your own. I have a theory about this, but I'm going to save that to the end as to why these things, as to why this similarity comes in.
Can I ask you just to surmise Joly's argument? I mean, when you say in hell, my thought is he didn't favor Machiavelli or
apparently not.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the first thing that comes to mind is there's all this talk about one world government and dictatorship and so on and so forth. He's against Napoleon III.
Napoleon III was a tyrant.
Right.
Okay. And these guys are talking about, I think, Montesquieu, he was a legal theoretician. Machiavelli, of course, was Machiavellian. Machiavelli would, of course, agree with the first thing we noted from the protocols, that the politics are not moral.
Right.
And they're kind of arguing over, Napoleon III and his policies. But the whole point here is to portray him as a vicious tyrant.
Okay.
So you can see, and all of the underhanded things which he's doing.
Sure.
So a lot of the terminology kind of works. You can kind of take some of the stuff that you're using to attack him, and now you can put it into the protocols as part of an evil Bond villain plan. So what you have is that the protocols actually exist. They are the turd on the plate. They are real. And what Katherine Rodzville was doing, to the satisfaction of the American Hebrew magazine, and then ultimately of Norman Cohn, is that she was providing a narrative to explain this. But as we'll see, there are other narratives that can be used to explain it. And Katherine Rodzville's narrative is only correct in the extent, really, that the protocols exist. Now, what she's doing is taking that basic fact that she's taking two basic facts, that they exist and that they incorporate portions of Joly's dialogue in hell. And then she's essentially inventing a fabric of falsehood in which to create this. Now, why is that a fabric of falsehood? Why is what she's saying here is wrong? And add a couple of other details. Who are Matvei Golovinsky and who is Pyotr Rochkovsky? And other version actually adds a third Russian into this, a fellow by the name of Ivan Manasevich Manuilov. Long name.
Yeah.
All right. So what are those? And those are all three very real people. They're not imaginary. They also, all three have something in common. They were all, at one point or another, employees of the Imperial Russian Secret Police, the Okhrana.
Interesting.
So the key point in Rodzville's whole story is that Golovinsky and Rochkovsky, with Manasevich Manuilov sort of hanging around in the background for good measure, that these were all part of a plan by the Russian Imperial Secret Police, that it was the Okhrana which had given the order and that they were simply carrying it out. So, you see there, you have the anti-Semitic Tsarist regime and its police agents in Paris are concocting this whole falsified document. They're essentially forging this document to prove a Jewish conspiracy because they believe that Jews are too closely connected to revolutionary circles in Russia, and therefore an attack upon the Jews is an attack upon the revolutionaries as well. even though in the protocols there's no direct references to that. There's direct references as, stirring up workers, but also creating both capitalism and communism. So it doesn't quite fit that model either. So what's wrong with that story? I mean, and this, so again, that's correct. All three of these guys did have some connection to them. Rodzville, in fact, was for a number of years the chief of the whole foreign operation of the Ukraina. So that was headquartered in Paris. Because Paris was full of anti-Tsarist Russian emigres. But he was the head of that. He was the head of Russian Secret Service operations outside Russia. So he would have been involved in that. Matvey Golovinsky also was involved in that process. And Ivan Manasevich Manuilov, who, among other things, was a erstwhile friend of one of my obsessions, Sidney Riley. Okay, so he also worked for the Ukraina. He was a kind of dirty trickster and also a con man and liar.
Huh.
So a thoroughly disreputable character. Nevertheless, the idea that they might have been there, but here's what's wrong with it. Right away, one of the people that began to look into that story was another Russian by the name of Vladimir Burtsev. And Vladimir Burtsev was an enemy of the Ukraina. So he has nothing good to say. Vladimir Burtsev is best described as the Sherlock Holmes of the Russian revolutionary movement. So he was an anti-Tsarist revolutionary, not a Bolshevik, not anything in particular. But he opposed Tsarism. The Ukraina was his great enemy. He had spent his whole life combating the Ukraina and also sussing out its agents in various. So what he was noted for was identifying Tsarist police agents within the revolutionary movement. So that's why he was called the Sherlock Holmes of it. So keep in mind, he has no reason to exonerate the Ukraina from anything. The Ukraina is an agent of evil as far as he's concerned, but he wanted the story told correctly. So he looked into this and he found out that, well, one of the problems with this is that Pyotr Rodzville had actually been fired from the Ukraina in 1904. He wasn't working for them. He'd been canned. He would ultimately be brought back into it, but he'd been canned in 1902. So he would have no reason to be doing this for the Ukraina. Matvey Golovinsky also wasn't working for the Ukraina in 1902. Manuilov might have been, but he's just standing around watching. Furthermore, Burtsev could find out, because he had good sources of information, is that neither Rodzville nor Golovinsky were in Paris in 1904 or 1905. And furthermore, neither was Katherine Rodzville. The apartment she claimed to have lived in, she didn't. There was no record of her being there. So she was making up a story about being in a place with people. None of them, the story she describes, could not have taken place because none of the principals were actually where she says they were at the time. She made it up to get paid for a story that would explain where the protocols came from. And you could all blame it on the Tsarist regime, which by 1920 is defunct anyway. So who really cares? By the way, the Soviets really like this version as well. They really like this version because, of course, anything that paints the old regime as being a bunch of vicious Jew-baiters, so much the better. So they're perfectly happy to go along with this. Which might well have a connection. Matvey Golovinsky, the one she says was actually writing this out. Guess who he went on to work for? The Soviet secret police. He would go to work for the Cheka, and he would be doing the same thing for them, often manufacturing fake documents. So, you have no... So one of the things you're noting in here already is that almost everyone in this story has some angle. They're generally not paragons of virtue when it comes to truth-telling, and some of them are outright con men and liars. So Norman Cohn's story, as put forward in Warrant of Genocide, while it appears to explain everything, actually explains nothing. And of course, here's the biggest problem with it. The elephant in the room with the whole thing. Even if Rodzville, I think Rodzville actually says she thinks Rodzville vanished in 1917. She has a mysterious, he didn't vanish he died in 1910. Okay. So a man who dies in 1910 can't vanish in 1917. But the big problem here is that, remember, she says this took place in 1904 and 1905. And what have I already mentioned? That the first iteration of the protocols appeared in a newspaper in St. Petersburg in 1903.
Yeah.
So you cannot create a document that has already been published. So her story is BS, as many of the others will be. Now, Cohn did get some support. In 1999, there was a Russian researcher by the name of Mikhail Lepechin, and he was actually going through some documents in Moscow, and what I think he was looking at were the French intelligence documents that were then held in the special archive in Moscow. So again, there's a little diversion here. One of the things that happened in World War II is that, France fell to the Germans in 1940. One of the things the Germans did was they took all of the French intelligence records and they took them to Berlin, or at least took them to Germany. And then when the Soviets took over Berlin, they inherited the French intelligence records. Did they give them back to their French allies? No, they loaded them on a train and they took them to Moscow and they put them into a special archive. And special meant it was an archive full of things that don't actually exist and no one can ever look at. Okay. This is where you take stuff and it is a black hole. And these things remained there until after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was a long, drawn-out process through which most of those records, first of all, in which the stuff in the secret or special archive was opened up briefly, and then most of it was returned to France. Not all of it. And I have talked to French archivists who've said that we didn't get all of it back. Of course, the Russians say we just lost it. Maybe the Germans did something with it. So, who knows? Nevertheless, what Lepechin was looking at, I believe, was that he was looking at the French intelligence files that basically told the same story that Rodzville was, and therefore seemed to back up Rodzville, except what he didn't note is that they were just repeating what she had said. There was no separate confirmation of this. They again had just accepted this story, and that appeared. And here again is one of those things that in terms of historical research, you've got to be careful of. You've got two different sources to say the same thing. Did they arrive at that story separately, or is one just repeating the other one? Because if you got the same story repeated 12 times, and it's just one repeating the other, you don't have 12 stories, you have one. So, Rodzville's story is out, and we know that it appeared in St. Petersburg in 1903. And again, as I noted, it appeared in Znamya, which was basically a publication devoted to extremist. Well, I know you could be an extreme monarchist because, in 1903, Russia was still an absolute monarchy. So how can you be an extremist by expressing your faith in what actually exists? But it was staunchly monarchist. And it also is connected, if you look back, some of the people who are part of it, it's not connected to the Okhrana. It's connected to this separate organization, a kind of patriotic secret society, if you will, called the Sacred Band. And yeah, they're taking that from Greek legend, the Sacred Band of Thebes, I think it was. But the Sacred Band were a group of supposedly Tsar-loving Russians who had dedicated their lives to protecting the imperial family and the imperial regime. And they might do that by cooperating with the secret police, but they would also do it on their own. They were a secret society dedicated to a political cause. And as mentioned, they really didn't like Jews. So Jews would make, in some ways, the kind of perfect villain for this type of thing. On the other hand, there's no clear sign that anyone in the newspaper, the question, where did that document come from? I mean, it doesn't appear that it was written by anyone there. And it also gets into the whole question as to, what the actual goal of that would be. And this actually predates the revolution of 1905, which was a kind of abortive revolution. It does go 1902, 1903 were periods of a lot of, there were a lot of anti-Jewish attacks, pogroms that took place. So tensions were growing. It fit into that. But the question for me is, where did it come from? Now, a fellow who actually did a very important piece of work in really discovering and popularizing, at least making, I think, the world aware of this original 1903 version, was an Italian scholar by the name of Cesare de Michelis. And he wrote a book, was translated in English. I wouldn't say it was scintillating reading, but if you're interested in the whole history and iteration of the protocols, it would be essential reading, called The Non-Existent Manuscript. And so one of the things that he tries to do there is he takes all the different versions he can find, the pre-1917 versions, and he tries to put together what he thinks might have been some kind of original Russian document. In other words, if we look through all of these, we find the things that are consistent. There are variations, but if we just look for the points in the dozen or so different versions of the protocols that are consistent, maybe we can come up with what is a original version. This maybe even something prior to the one that appears in Znamya. And his idea seems to be, I think I'm doing his views justice, is that the origins of it are probably Russian. Maybe this was created sometime around 1897, 1898. But it's not entirely clear because the dialogues, we were talking about, that he's also able to show. I mean, he goes through this meticulously. Okay. And in the book, he'll go through and he creates his reconstructed Russian version of the protocols, and then he will show you in the notes all the exact quotes from the dialogue that appear there. So that's how you can go through and count them up in terms of what those are. So that means that since the dialogues were in French, that they would have had to have been translated into Russian. But the question, then that creates the idea, was that the whole thing translated from French? So this would be you got a manuscript here. You know that 40% of it had to come from French. So could all of it have been translated from French? Which would suggest to me, I would differ from de Michelis in here, is that I would bet, not the farm, but, all of the chickens at least, and maybe most of the livestock, that the origins of the protocols are in France. And they come out of 1890s France. Because there were a whole series of things going on in France in that period. And just to briefly go over them, might have mentioned these in other episodes, France was full of scandals. And a couple of those scandals, one was a thing called the Panama Scandal. And it was the Panama Canal Company that went bankrupt, cost hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen and French women their life savings, was a big deal. And as it turned out, the principal villains, or the people who got, considered to have mismanaged the company, were all Jewish, or mostly Jewish, and also Jews with German names. And that seems to have, that was one. Jews were, or Jewish names were publicly connected with a financial scandal and excoriated as villains. Then, also in the 1890s, you have the Dreyfus Affair, in which Alfred Dreyfus, an army officer, is accused of treason, another Jew with a German name, and that, of course, becomes famous. Another Jew is held up now as being a traitor. And then the third element you have is the Taxil hoax, and that was a huge Masonic conspiracy theory that argued that at the heart of Freemasonry was a satanic baby-killing society. It was like Pizzagate in France in the 1890s, and a fellow who used the name Leo Taxil wrote a whole series of books and articles talking about the whole satanic masonry and its horrible agenda that it had. So this is the whole mix you get in France. They're worried about devil worshippers and Jews. And that, I think, is the perfect environment to craft something like the protocols.
Yeah.
Because note what it combines. it combines to take it seriously. You have to be afraid of two things. Okay. There are two boogeymen in it. The boogeymen are the Jews and the Masons.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is something that I don't think it only have been created in 1890s France, but I'll bet you that's where it came from. Which means that in Katherine Rodzville's story, there may be an element of truth, because if she's saying that it was originally crafted in Paris, I think in that case, maybe accidentally, she's fundamentally correct. She might even, through her collection of gossip, have known something about that, but that's why she places its creation there. Still doesn't tell us who exactly put these things together. Now, there's another interesting sideline to this that it enters into sort of geopolitics. Another important thing, an important thing to keep in mind is that in the 1890s, Republican France and Tsarist Russia enter into an alliance, the famous Entente, which will lead those two countries into World War I as allies, with England later tacked into the mix. But it's in the 1890s, beginning of the 1890s, that France and Russia, two countries with completely incompatible political systems, would create an alliance against Germany. And that in some ways was a kind of difficult alliance to manage. I mean, there were people in France who were uncomfortable with being allied with absolutist Russia. And a lot of this, by the way, were Freemasons who weren't too keen about that. And in Russia, you had people, like those people connected to Znamya, the more fundamentalist monarchists would argue we're not too keen about being allied with Republican France. So what's keeping them together? Money is keeping them together. So what it was that Russia in the 1890s is also going through a big spate of industrialization. And to do that, they have to do two things. One is they have to court foreign loans. Russia is resource rich, but it is capital poor. It's not generating enough internal capital to exploit its natural resources. So where do you go for capital? Go to Western Europe. And Western banks who will make loans to the Russian government, and Western companies or financial institutions that will invest in Russia. And both of these things become a major part of this. And the key point is that 85% of Russia's foreign loans and investment come from France. The German bankers turn the Russians down. So German banks are not interested in developing Russia for what they argue is a very simple reason. Germany sells a lot of manufactured goods and industrial goods to Russia. If Russia industrializes and, if Russia produces its own locomotives, they won't be buying them from us. Therefore, it is no great incentive for us to develop the Russian economy. France, on the other hand, whose main enemy is Germany, isn't too concerned about that. So the stronger Russia is, the more cannons it can produce, the more that they will like that idea. So the Germans, now what this did was that it created there's a kind of battle which is going on in the French press, because again, there are people weighing in for and against the Russian alliance. And articles are written on both sides of this. And one of the people who gets mixed up in this is a fellow by the name of Gérard Encausse. And Gérard Encausse is a physician. He's also an occultist. He's a Rosicrucian and a Freemason and a Martinist. And he's the founder of the whole Martinist, and he's the founder of the whole, resumed Martinist order, which is formed in the late 1880s.
Okay.
Now, more important than that, maybe, is that in the early 20th century, that is around, I think, 1903 or so, he goes to Russia and becomes a spiritual advisor to Nicholas and Alexandra.
Wow.
He is the original. Well, there's actually another Frenchman before him. There's his mentor, a guy by the name of Master Philippe, is there for a while. But he becomes the guy who sort of paves the way for Rasputin.
Okay.
So Rasputin was only the last in a whole series of of spiritual gurus that Nicholas, mostly Alexandra, had. But Pappus, which is his magical name. So Girardin Cohn is known as Pappus, and Pappus goes to Russia. He has seances in the imperial palace. He raises the ghost of Alexander III. But his other job, what he's also part of, is he's a French political agent. So you got to think about it. A French mystic now installs himself in St. Petersburg as the guru, as the official wizard of the Russian Tsar, and that gives him influence over them. Now, this very same man, this same Gerard Encausse or Pappus, under assumed names, writes articles. I think one of them is around 1901, 1902 in French newspapers, basically talking about how important the Russian and French alliance is for the French economy, and arguing that there is a conspiracy. That there is a conspiracy to destroy this, that anything which is set against the alliance of Russia is all part of a, wait for it, Jewish-German conspiracy. Because his argument is the German banks are dominated by Jews. Some are, most aren't. But in the French mind, those two things, remember, in the French mind, because of Dreyfus and the Panama Canal scandal, remember, these were all Jews with German surnames. So Germany is the great enemy of France. Jews have been shown to be enemies or, accused of being traitors and enemies to France. And of course, it would be German Jewish bankers who would want to destroy our wonderful alliance with Russia. Yeah. So Pappus, later advisor to the Tsar in the same period, writes articles basically arguing that there is at least in this case, a German Jewish banking conspiracy to dominate Europe and to destroy the alliance. So that's led to some accusations that Pappus himself could have been the author of the protocols. I don't really buy that, but it shows you how complex the picture becomes, that there are lots of things which are becoming involved in this.
Sure.
That the whole issue of the Franco-Russian alliance is tied up in all of this question as well. But I do think pretty firmly that the origins of the protocols come out of that French milieu in the 1890s. There, I've used the word milieu one more time because it's extremely useful. So it's the other story that you'll often hear about the protocols. And I think Norman Cohn repeats this. This is the way the story generally goes. Remember, Rodzville claimed that they were crafted in 1904 and 1905 in Paris. And then where did they first appear in that version? Yeah. Well, they first appeared in a book published in Russia in 1905 called The Great in the Small and the Antichrist by a fellow by the name of Sergey Nilus, Nilus. Again, a real guy, although often misrepresented in the way, most of the things you read about Sergey Nilus is that he was some kind of like bearded Russian Orthodox mystic. He was a religious fanatic of some kind. That doesn't really seem to be true. He's actually a lawyer and a magistrate. And at one time a landowner. So he came from a landowning family and he was trained in the law. He did go through a kind of religious epiphany, and decided that he was going to spend time in a monastery. And so he became quite devoted. He sort of drifted away from religion and then came back to, he was a born again Russian Orthodox Christian, but he was not, what could be truly said, he was not a member of the clergy. He was not a monk. I think it'd be probably unfair to categorize him as a religious fanatic, but he was a person who had gone through a kind of conversion and was very interested in this. And what he thought was that the whole 20th century was going to go to hell and the Antichrist was going to come, which oddly enough, people still talk about. So here's a little history of his book, The Great and the Small. It has a much longer title, but we're just going to stick with The Great and the Small. It was first published in 1903. The same year that the original protocols appeared, but it didn't contain them. That they don't appear until the revised edition in 1905. And in 1905, they appear as an appendix, because remember, the protocols are more a pamphlet than they are, it's small. So they're simply tacked on as an appendix. As, you know, I kind of ran across this blueprint for world domination. Sounds like something the Antichrist would be into, you know. Could the Jews ally themselves with the Antichrist? Well, the Freemasons, you know, they're all part of this whole mixture. But that's why it's there. It's there as a kind of afterthought. He didn't write it, never claims to, and it wasn't there in the first edition in the same year that the actual first of the appearance of the protocols took place. So, the protocols were not created in Paris in 1904 and 1905. The version which appeared as an appendix in Nilus's book in the edition in 1905 was not the original one. The original one is just there, and we still don't know where it came from. So up until the end of World War I, all of this stuff pretty much, the protocols don't seem to circulate anywhere outside of Russia. Remember, they made that 1903 appearance. Nilus then takes a slightly modified edition. So his 1905 version is not the same as the 1903 version. Who changed that? Did he do it? He says that he was given the copy that he included by a woman. Now, we'll come back to that point. So he seems to have gotten a copy which is somewhat different than the 1903 copy from someone, if his story is to be believed. But after 1917, well, you got the Russian Revolution, you have the Russian diaspora, you've got hundreds of thousands of Russians who don't want any part of the new glorious People's Republic fleeing abroad. And where do they congregate? They congregate in places like Berlin, Paris, New York, San Francisco, but especially Paris. And so you got a whole new wave of Russian emigres, and this is when the protocols begin to metastasize around the world. So in 1919, a copy of the protocols, a Russian copy, is brought to New York. It's not, there was a Russian military mission in New York. Remember, Russia was part of the Allied powers. The Russians had a purchasing commission. And there was a particular Russian official there by the name of Boris Brazil. Boris Brazil was a lawyer. He was a staunch Russian monarchist. That is, he was exactly of the same kind of opinion of the people who had published Znamya some years earlier. He would have been completely down for everything they were down with. And the other thing about it is, of course, he also really didn't like Jews. He was an outspoken, virulent anti-Semite, as people would say. So, you know, he somehow, and it's a convoluted story, that I have to briefly summarize here. Brazil seems to have been instrumental in getting this copy. He then gives it to another Russian-American woman, and he has her translated into English. And thus, an American English copy of the protocols emerges. Now remember, you're taking a document that was probably originally in French, translated into Russian, translating it into English. There are going to be differences, and you now get another iteration. Interesting thing is that there's in that same year, 1919, 1920, a second American edition of the protocols emerges. So two pop up, one published in New York, one published in Boston. Another version emerges in Britain in 1920. By 1922, we've got editions in French, retranslated back into French. You've now got a German version which appears by 1922. Same time. Remember that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis are getting going to provide extra fuel there. And it will just spread all over the world. There will be Chinese versions, Japanese versions, Spanish versions, Italian versions, all by the early 20s. So that's why in 1920 and 1921, the protocols are getting this attention, because now they're popping up all around the world. And so they will get attention from different, this is what encourages Henry Ford, in 1921 to buy the Dearborn Independent, a small newspaper, and essentially turn that into a publishing house for the International Jew, which is his repackaging of the protocols. So everything that Ford came to believe and write about Jews and their conspiracy comes from the protocols. And by the way, one of his advisors, the guy who's helping him come to those conclusions, is Boris Brassel.
Oh, really?
Okay. So the same guy who brings the protocols, or at least one copy of them, to America and arranges its publication, this dyed-in-the-wool Russian monarchist anti-Semite Boris Brassel, is the same fellow who would then become a special advisor to Henry Ford on the Jewish question.
Now, are they connected because Ford's doing business in Russia? Like isn't he selling tractors or something?
Well, he's selling tractors to the Bolsheviks. I mean, that's what his business is.
Sure.
Okay. So his business is selling cars. He'll sell cars to Jews. He has no problems with that.
Right.
Okay. But Ford is a fellow who was, there's a whole interesting series of articles from the 1920s called which is something like the origins of Henry Ford's Jew mania.
Okay.
And in that, a reporter for Hearst's international magazine.
Yeah.
Does an expose. It has a lot to do with showing the relationship between Ford and white Russians, including Brassel and others. And I think Norman Hapgood, the guy's name is Hapgood, and he writes a series of articles that appear in Hearst magazine. And he basically argues that this goes back to the 1915 Ford's misadventure with a peace ship during World War I. So Henry Ford was, among other things, also a pacifist. Okay. He also disliked bankers in general. Wasn't just Jewish bankers. He didn't like banks because he thought that, and this was why he wanted the Ford Motor Company to be self-financing.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want banks to come in and essentially take over financial control of his corporation. So he was down on banks, and in the public mind, you tended to, and it's still the case, one tends to identify, when people talk about finance, international finance, it's always used, you're using it as a code word for Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, there is international finance, and there are banks, and there are all kinds of nasty things that happen that in finance as a whole. But Jewish names and individuals, an extremely small part of the overall Jewish population, every Jew owns a hat shop or something, or a delicatessen. I mean, those are the people that never come up. No one ever raises, Saul, who owns a delicatessen, as being an example of a world conspiracy, because he just doesn't fit that. That would be ridiculous. But a banker? Okay. Yeah. A Jacob Schiff? Possibly. I mean, Jacob Schiff was probably, given that he was a banker involved in international finance, I would have to say that he was probably involved in all kinds of, shall we say, questionable shit.
Yeah.
Okay. None of which has necessarily anything to do with a plan to take over the world, but these names become prominent. Yeah. They become a prominent face. So Ford disliked bankers. He probably had a general suspicion of Jews to begin with, although he was perfectly capable of being friends with individuals. And the peace ship, he was also a pacifist. And so he thought the war was a bad idea, possibly brought on by bankers, which, might well have been right about that. I think he was onto something. And so what he did is he chartered a Scandinavian ocean liner. I think it was the first Oscar the second. And his idea was he was going to have a kind of civil peace mission. He was going to go, look, I've chartered this whole ocean liner. I'm going to go over, I'm going to park it out on the Baltic Sea somewhere, and I invite all the warring parties to come in and start negotiations. It was not an ill-intentioned idea. It was completely unrealistic under the circumstances, and nothing really happened. And in the end, he was embarrassed by it because he had done, with good intentions. I think he tried to broker a peace. It didn't work out. Now, some of the people who were involved in pushing him into this were, I'm not sure I can remember there was a particular reporter who, and a Russian American, a Russian Jewish American by the name of Herman Bernstein, born in Russia, raised there, came to the U.S., then became a kind of left-wing journalist, gradually sort of drifted more towards the center or the right. But Herman Bernstein was on the peace ship and had been involved in this. And Rosika Schwimmer. Okay, Rosika Schwimmer was Jewish from Hungary, more or less a member of the radical left, but also a pacifist. And she had a great influence on Ford in getting him to do this. So the argument, and I'm not sure this explains everything, that Ford later felt that he had been talked into this whole peace ship thing that sort of blew up in his face and most of the people involved in this, he saw, were Jews, and therefore that sort of added to his idea that, Jews had gotten him into trouble. Whether that was it or I don't know. It probably contributed to the whole thing.
I just assumed it had some, like William Dudley Pelley, the story basically being he was a screenwriter, then had some kind of falling out with Jews in Hollywood.
Which is exactly what he did. He was a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he was dealing largely with Jewish studio executives. Yeah. And like most writers, writer in Hollywood, studio executives. Do those people ever see eye to eye? Yeah. No.
But I figured it was something like that. I just thought it was interesting and was curious if there was some kind of business.
A lot of this has to do with the personal interactions that people have had, and then how much you want to make out of the ethnicity of the people you had the personal interactions with.
Yeah.
But Ford latches onto this, and for most of the 20s, he will spew out, I think there are 91 different installments of the internet. I mean, he goes on about this far longer than the protocols ever did. I mean, it gets elaborated out of all proportion to what was originally there, but they are his inspiration. And Boris Brasol, this white Russian emigre, anti-Semite, also, a member of the same Black Hundreds group. Now, here's the interesting thing about Brasol. Well, I have to admit it's just, he's a fascinating character, and it's just, the guy is not stupid. All right. This is one of the things you often find out about bad people, is that they're actually quite bright. Brasol, during World War II, when he was, under investigation by the U.S. Army and the FBI as a possible Nazi propaganda agent, which he was, but which he cleverly dodged any kind of arrest, he was asking for his opinion to the protocols. And his opinion was, I think that they're probably fake.
Interesting.
Okay. Probably a forgery is what he said. Now, here's a guy who was instrumental in getting them translated into English and popularized, instrumental in convincing Henry Ford of their legitimacy, who then, when actually asked in a legal situation, will say, I think they're probably a forgery. Now, was he just saying that? Who knows? But again, it's an example that when is this person telling the truth? I mean, what he's saying, almost define forgery as you will, but the protocols fall into that. So he's telling the truth about it. Of course, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't turn on to say that just because they're a forgery doesn't mean that the story they're telling isn't true. Why would that necessarily be the case? And by the way, that is a justification that we hear from many people today who accept, they'll argue that yes, the protocols were is the notes of an actual meeting, they're kind of ridiculous. So they're probably notes to a meeting that never occurred, and they're not really notes, but that the general outline of what they say, maybe what they say doesn't even necessarily involve Jews or Freemasons, or maybe it does, but the whole idea that there's a them,
right?
And there's a them out there who are manipulating things.
Yeah.
Now, before we actually started this episode, we were kind of talking about that, and the whole question is, do things just happen, or is there always someone behind them? And an extremely popular idea you will find today, it's always been a popular idea on both the right and the left. Whether you're talking about Fox or whether you're talking about MSNBC or who you're talking about, is the idea is that there's a them.
Right.
All right. There is an organized conspiracy which is seeking to undermine our society. and which is under threat by a conspiracy of them. All you have to do is put whatever your name to who the them is.
Yeah, it's convenient that it is always the people who are opposing what you believe as well, right?
And they're all organized, and they're dangerous, and they're going to take over, and they're going to come and kill you in your sleep unless you do something about it right away.
Yeah.
So I think most people, or a very large proportion of the public, accepts that it accepts the idea that there's some sort of insidious manipulation of society and environment, that things aren't just happening, that people are making these things happen. And so the protocols simply become a version of that, which now puts Jews and Freemasons together as them. Now, to show you how you can manipulate this, I said that in 1920, 2 American versions of the protocols, of the actual protocols, appear. But before that had happened, in 1919, in the Philadelphia Ledger, again in a newspaper, there was a journalist by the name of Karl Ackerman. And Karl Ackerman had gotten a copy of the protocols in Russia. He'd covered there, and, apparently they were handing these things out. And he got a hold of the protocols, and he brought it back to the States, and he looked at it, and he changed it around. He essentially took the protocols, but he eliminated all the references to Jews and Freemasons and turned it into radicals and Bolsheviks. And now this was a plot. The same thing with little alterations.
Right.
All he did was to replace the names and now say this is a Bolshevik plot for world domination, and it played just as well.
To your point, let's get more specific about pre-recorded conversation. I was recounting to you that colleague who is probably more on the left side of the spectrum was recounting a fear of AI and tech oligarchs that essentially, I told this person, sounded a lot like Alex Jones circa 2000 and what he had harped on for many years. I'm from Central Texas and well aware of, early Alex Jones essentially being there's a one world government of, elites at the Bohemian Grove and they're working to, COVID was, an example, a depopulation experiment. But she was saying things very, very similar just from that perspective. And so to your point, you switch Bolsheviks with Jews, or you just change it, but the narrative stays the same, right? And that's what a conspiracy.
You just change around the them. But again, this is based upon a real document. But Ackerman simply took, and why did he do that in 1919? Because the Bolsheviks were now the boogeymen. And so he simply wanted to have and probably a significant part of the Philadelphia Ledger's readership was Jewish, and we can't make them, and God knows Philadelphia is the Masonic character. So let's turn into Bolsheviks. Everybody hates them.
Yeah.
So he just took it and which gives you some ideas how the whole thing is created to begin with, as to where someone decided they were just going to combine the fear of Freemasonry and the fear of Jews into a single conspiracy. We'll just work that in, and then Ackerman could go and simply change the name around. But you've got other, there was the ongoing debate over the legitimacy of the protocols we continued in the early 1920s. Henry Ford would eventually decide that this whole thing was hurting his sales, and he would, I would say, half-heartedly recant his anti-Semitism in 1927 or 1928. But that was probably more or maybe he did just get tired of it. Maybe he decided that he'd been fooled again. There was a Frenchman by the name of Alexander Duchaila, who also in 1921 was sort of jumped on the bandwagon, again was paid to say this. And Duchaila jumped on the bandwagon by backing up Katherine Rodzville's story. Yeah, he'd heard basically the same thing. He may actually be the one that adds Manasevich Manuilov into the mix. But it's the same type of thing. He's completely unreliable. He was a Frenchman who got involved in the Russian Civil War. But one of the things that he was revealed to be in Russia was a Soviet agent. So he's a guy who's pretending to be a Frenchman who's a friend of the White Russians, but he's actually working for the Red Russians, although he said that he had stopped that. But again, from the Soviet point of view, the Rodzville story is the one that they prefer. And it's one because it paints the old regime in as bad a light as possible. And what Dushaila almost certainly was simply another unscrupulous, an unscrupulous character motivated by greed and maybe ideology to basically try to prop up the narrative that come forward, almost certainly at the behest of Soviet intelligence. That's what he was doing. Then the other thing that sort of set this off is a little bit before this in 1920. I think it's in 1920, the Times in London had run an article about the protocols because these had been published in English in Britain, and somebody had read it and they go, "Oh my, what's this? A Jewish Masonic plot to overtake the world." And they ran an article which didn't try to debunk it or otherwise. It just said, "This is a shocking story." It was something, the headline was like a very curious document or a very disturbing document. So a British journalist by the name of Graves doubted the authenticity of this. It just didn't quite pass his smell test. So he decided to hunt down the origins of it. And this took him, this is like a Graham Greene novel. He goes up to Constantinople. So Constantinople in 1920, which is, just swimming with every conspiracy you can come up with. And of course, you've got a lot of white Russian emigres there. And he's eventually introduced to this Russian officer named Rodzville, I think. And Rodzville gives him a copy. And Rodzville had been involved in white Russian army counterintelligence and propaganda. And one of the things that Rodzville said that his job was to investigate links between the Bolsheviks and Masonry. White Russians very suspicious of Freemasons and also Jews. Okay. There was this very strong current of anti-Jewish and anti-Masonic feeling in those quarters. And this is where he'd come across the document. And up in one corner of this document, Graves notes that there were the initials A.S. And again, to make a long story somewhat shorter, what Graves eventually discovered is that he'd gotten this copy from Rodzville, which said, "Yeah, this is the copy." And it was here that Graves begins to figure out. He makes the discovery that if you compare this to the protocols, that the portions of Joly's book seem to be. So Graves is the first one who realizes that there are parts of this 1860s French political tract written by Maurice Joly digested in the protocols. Now, there's various questions about this. There are questions as to whether or not Graves' motivations were entirely journalistic or he also had some kind of ideological component. There's also a lot of things to at least suggest, I'm not sure that it's true, that he's sort of being led by the nose to these discoveries. I mean, he's led to Constantinople. Go there and you'll find something out. He's led to Rodzville, who gives him the manuscript, who points out the connections between Joly. All of this is being sort of fed to, and I'd have to say, without buying that completely, I think it's not paranoid or entirely paranoid to suggest that Graves was being led to these discoveries and that he either later sort of covered up how that process went on or he was just being, that someone wanted him to find that and they were pointing in that direction. So he raises this whole question of that, and then that's what causes the description of Joly, Rodzville and Dushaila to come forward with their stories, because now they can connect all of these things together. They can describe how this whole process of the dialogue being digested or being turned into the protocols, which they weren't. They were just kind of, again, selectively strip mined to be used within it. We still don't know why. You could have used other things. Why couldn't you think of that stuff on your own? I mean, why did you need that?
Yeah.
This is the point I would bring up. I don't think that Joly's dialogue was necessary to the creation of the basic plot points that you wanted there. They were just kind of conveniently used as if you sort of had something handy that you could come up with to sort of add this in. So this is what gets the whole ball rolling, but we've seen that Dushaila's and Rodzville's stories has no actual basis in fact, which still leaves us as to where all of this stuff is coming from. Even Herman Bernstein, the Russian Jewish American journalist, who gets involved in this, he comes up with his own version of it as well, which, by the way, is completely different. So Bernstein argues that the whole inspiration for the protocols was a novel written, I think, again in the 1860s or 1870s called Biarritz by a German writer, Hermann Goethe, who wrote under the name of Sir John Redcliffe. Okay, so you got a German writing under an English name, and in Biarritz, which is a novel, it's not supposed to be factual. There is the whole. It includes an episode in which the rabbi of Prague holds a meeting for all the other rabbis from the 12 tribes. Who knew there were still 12 tribes? Okay. Thought the 10 had disappeared. But somehow in Prague, Rabbi Judah Lev of Prague calls a meeting and all the leaders of the 12 tribes show up and they all have, and this is where they supposedly put forward their plan about overthrowing the Goyim and installing a kind of Jewish monarchy. That's the cemetery in Prague speech.
Okay.
Which then, now, Umberto Eco, Italian writer Umberto Eco, in, I think, The Prague Cemetery, one of his books, it digests all of these things again into a novel. So, and I think it's a very interesting novel, but again, Eco kind of accepts elements of all these stories, but what he's creating is a work of fiction, which just further muddies the water. Because he's now combining all of these elements together. So Bernstein thought it was this novel, Biarritz, and the whole rabbi speech in Prague that had inspired the protocols, which may have played a role in it. But see, in his version, Joly's dialogue doesn't even exist. And yet Joly's dialogue is clearly what you don't find are excerpts from Goethe's novel in the protocols.
Yeah.
What you do find are excerpts from Joly's dialogue. So, are you all confused at this point as to what exactly you should be? See, this is it. Confusion is the first step towards illumination. First of all, what you have to do is you have to clear out all of the bullshit. That is what you have to do first. And we still come back to this, turd on a plate. You still got this document that exists, this document which has fueled so much hatred and arguably done so much harm, and you still can't trace where it came from or what hand is responsible for it. Wasn't Rashkovsky? I don't know. Maybe Golovinsky on his own had something to do with it. Who knows what little elements of truth might be sneaking around in this. Now, in the 1930s, the protocols actually get involved in a court case in Switzerland. And, the Nazis had come to power in Germany, and they were also really interested in spreading their influence to places like predominantly Germanic Switzerland. And so local Nazis began sort of, publishing and distributing, giving away their version of the protocols in Switzerland. And the Swiss Jewish community decided that they were going to strike back against that. And they decided that they would make a legal challenge that the protocols, or this particular iteration of it, violated Swiss law because there was a law in the Swiss books against pornography. And the Swiss law against pornography basically argued that it was illegal to publish or to disseminate material that could cause moral harm to the reader. And they argued that this could cause moral harm to the reader. And so this became a court case in 1930s Switzerland. And, Dushaila, this con man and possible Soviet, it was called in again, and for a lot of money gave his same testimony. And basically, the Swiss court heard different witnesses. I think there were two important witnesses who came in and argued that, yes, this is certainly a fake, this is a hoax. Another fellow wasn't so sure, however. So they got a split, because the defense's argument was that you can't prove it's not true. Okay. All these people, you can't prove that any of these versions before it came is true. So since you cannot prove it's true, now, in the case of pornography, or this is a work of fiction, but you can't actually prove that. And the case went on from like 1933 to 1937. And in 1937, the Swiss Supreme Court decided ultimately that the whole statute against pornography didn't apply to this case, and the judgment was thrown out. So first they get a split judgment, then it's thrown out, which in Switzerland left the whole thing in legal limbo. And then we go on to World War II and the fall of the Third Reich, and the issues go from there. But that's where so much of this stood. And that, again, is why in 1967, when Norman Cohn quite honestly came across what appeared to be a narrative that explained this, in the absence of any other one. See, this is it. If you take Rodzville's narrative, which simply inspired Du Chaillu's, and you throw it out, which it deserves to be, there's no alternative one there. Now, here's where I said earlier on that I had a kind of theory, and it's just that. It's a theory. It's not a fact. I'm not going to try to promote this to the exclusion of anything else, but I think it works. Okay. I think it's a better narrative, maybe, or maybe not. You be the judge. So remember we said that there is a connection. There is some sort of link between Maurice Joly, his 1865 Dialogues in Hell, and the protocols, because someone incorporated large components of that into the latter. We don't know who, and we don't know why that particular work. Which brings us to the question of exactly who Maurice Joly was. Now, you can go online and you can pull up his Wikipedia page. And if you look at his Wikipedia page, you'll notice that it says that he was born on the 22nd of September, 1829, in Lons-le-Saunier, Jura, which is in eastern France, near the Swiss border. And that he died in Paris on the 15th of July, 1878. Now, Joly is in some ways a fairly obscure character. He's real. He's not imaginary. He did exist. He was a lawyer. He certainly didn't like Napoleon III, and he was kind of overjoyed when Napoleon III fell, but he was also a frustrated political office seeker. And that's maybe one of the things to keep in mind about him. He always thought he was going to get somewhere in politics, and he never did. He was angry. And he always picked fights with people. He almost always feuded with people who were his friends. So in 1870, he wrote a little kind of autobiography. And in this, he says about himself that, yes, he was born in Lons-le-Saunier, okay, same town. But he notes that he was born in the first years of the reign of King Louis Philippe. Now, King Louis Philippe, who was a Freemason, only came to the throne in 1830. So there's something off here. If Joly was born in 1829, that was before Louis Philippe came to the throne. Now, maybe he just forgot, there's a little bit of leeway, but what he says doesn't match with an 1829 birth date. So then you begin looking around in birth records, the birth records that are available, and one of the things you find is that you can't find any Maurice Joly born in 1829. Just not there. You can find two Maurice Jolys that are born in 1838, which is in the first years. Now, it's almost a decade later, but it does fit with what he said. He said he was born early in the reign of King Louis Philippe, and Louis Philippe will be on the throne until 1848, so that would fit. In the first case, though, and the interesting thing about that, is that there's a death record for Joly in 1878 in the Parisian archives. And that simply notes that he was born in 1829? No. It says he was born in about 1838. So that seems to strengthen the idea that Joly's birth year has been misrepresented, and he was actually about a decade younger than he actually was. But it doesn't give a specific date. It also gives a different town. It says that his birthplace was a place called Noublans, not Lons-le-Saunier. But the two towns are both in the Jura regions, and they're both quite close to each other. That's kind of odd. So it's a different town, but it's a town just right next door. And they're a different way. He could have been actually born in Noublans, and his birth was registered in the other town. All of this suggests that we're talking about the same guy. Now, the other interesting thing is that the death record gives his date of death as the 16th of July, as opposed to the 15th of July. Now, it certainly begs coincidence that a Maurice Joly, not a common name, you're not going to have two of them dying in Paris one day apart. So this is the same guy. The probable explanation for this is his death was widely assumed to be suicide, and that his body wasn't discovered until the 16th, and it was assumed that he died on the 15th. So this was a preliminary report. It also identifies him as a lawyer, which he was in the death report. So you put all of those things together, the Joly who died, whose death is recorded on the 16th of July, is the same guy. This is the historical writer. This is the guy who wrote the diary. But notice the uncertainty about it. You don't even know how old he was. It's not even clear whether his death was a suicide, or just there were people who later claimed that he was murdered. Why would he be murdered? The second Maurice Joly, who was born in 1838, was born in a different province. He also was married in that town in 1865 and died there in 1908. So,
different guy
entirely. Now, so there are obscure things about Joly himself, but one of the things that's important about him is that he was friends early on. And at the time that he was writing the dialogue, the attack on Napoleon III, he was close friends with a French politician by the name of Adolphe Cremieux. And Adolphe Cremieux he was an enemy of Napoleon III. He was another lawyer. He was a Freemason. He was a Scottish Rite Freemason. In fact, he was the head, I believe, the Grand Master of the Grand Orient Lodge and also the Grand Master of the Scottish Rite in France. He was one of the most important Masons in France. And he was also, wait for it, Jewish. He was also president of the Alliance Universelle Israelite, the Alliance Israelite Universelle, the Universal Israelite, the largest Jewish association in France. I'll quit butchering French and just put it the Universal Israelite Alliance. So, one of the top, arguably the top, or one of the most prominent Freemasons in 1860s, 1870s France, and also a prominent Jew. Interesting how those things then get combined. Now, Cremieux and Joly were buddies, or at least they shared political opinions in the 1860s. But after Napoleon III fell, Cremieux prospered and went on to hold important positions within the Third Republic. Joly did not. And by the time of Joly's death, he became a bitter enemy of Cremieux. Now, he felt that his friend had betrayed him. So here's what I think might have happened. Towards the end of his life, sometime, let's say around 1877, 1878, an embittered Maurice Joly decided to sit down and write a scathing expose or denunciation of his former friend and now enemy, Adolphe Cremieux. And he had two things about Cremieux that he could combine together in this, that Cremieux was Jewish, which made him somewhat suspect in the eyes of many, and that also he was a prominent Freemason. And what he decided to do, maybe being a little lazy, but also thinking of recycling work, it was he who took his own dialogue and just took parts of that to create this denunciation of Cremieux. And maybe he thought that would even piss off Cremieux even more, because Cremieux had arguably encouraged him and helped him write the dialogue, and now to see himself attacked using the same terminology that Joly had attacked their common enemy, Napoleon III. Imagine reading yourself about yourself being denounced in the same, using some of the same term for the Napoleon III that you had despised. So my best bet is the guy who actually created the first version of the protocols, maybe not organized his protocols, was Maurice Joly himself, because he had the greatest access and knowledge of his own work, and he simply repurposed much of the dialogue for an attack upon Cremieux, and that's what combined the Masonic and the Jewish elements. And arguably a tip-off to that is that at least in some, if not all, of the protocols, there'll be, the recording secretary, the secretary of the 33rd degree. It would be the secretary that only applies to one thing, the Scottish Rite. 33rd degree is only relevant to the Scottish Rite, of which Cremieux was the head. So I wouldn't swear to it. I'm not saying it's the only narrative can exist, but I think that is a likely explanation, is that the raw material for the protocols did appear in France, and that it was probably something that was found in Joly's papers by someone else. Don't really know who that was. Now, I think I might have mentioned that there was also a story, maybe before we were talking, that Maurice Joly had a son, Charles Joly, and that Charles Joly became a journalist. And as a journalist, he worked for a while in Russia. Because put it this way, there is a Charles Joly who is a journalist, real person. He's basically a theater critic. He writes about theater, and he wrote for a French-Russian publication. He visited St. Petersburg in the 1890s. He worked at a newspaper called Le Figaro. And Le Figaro was one of those important newspapers that supported the Franco-Russian alliance. And guess who else worked at Le Figaro? Gerard Anca's Pappas. Also, Ivan Manasevich Manuilov worked there. Also, Matvei Golovinsky works there. So notice that these names that crop up in the creation of the protocols in this, but Golovinsky, Manasevich, and now Charles Joly. And the story was that Charles Joly is the son of Maurice Joly, who inherited his papers, and that this is how that manuscript. Now, that to me would explain not how Golovinsky and the others crafted the manuscript, but how some sort of basic template showed up in their hands. And that they then further adapted this attack on Adolphe Cremieux into a Jewish world conspiracy. Now, there's a problem with that. Maurice Joly had no son named Charles Joly, to be determined, had no children at all. So there was a Charles Joly, but that Charles Joly was not Maurice Joly's son. Could have been a relative. It's possible that he might have been a nephew, although there's no sign of that. Someone else in the family who came along and got a hold of the papers, or maybe his last name was simply Joly and he claimed to be related to him. So there are other stories. I mentioned that that copy of the protocols that Graves, the Times reporter, got in Constantinople in 1920 had the initials AS up in the corner of it. And that supposedly are the initials of another white Russian general another fellow who was a member of this thing called the Holy Band, that kind of secret society dedicated to the Tsar. And it is a General Sukhotin. I think his first name is either Alexei or Alexander. It's got to be one of those two. But General Sukhotin, this was his personal copy. And then also remember I mentioned that Sergey Nilus, the writer who would then include a version of the protocols in the appendix of his book in 1905, said he got his version from a woman. So this brings us to yet another, and for our purposes, the last version of where the protocols came from. And I think it is an American woman, Pakita de Shishmarev. Okay. She's got a story. Okay. If her name is Pakita de Shishmarev, you've got a story. She wrote under the name Leslie Fry. Okay. L. Fry is what she would use. She became a prominent figure. She was sort of connected to William Dudley Paley, the whole kind of American right. She, would rub elbows with Boris Brazil. Now her idea, of course, is that the protocols are real. She argues that they're real. They're authentic. Even if they were forged, they were authentic because they tell a true story. So the heroine of her story isn't Katherine Rodzville. It's another Russian noblewoman with the name of Justine Glinka. So Justine Glinka in the 1880s is given a copy of the protocols by a renegade Jew by the name of Joseph Schorst. I don't know. Apparently he got mad at other Jews and he stole a copy of the protocols from the headquarters of the Scottish Rite in Paris. Adolf Camus' Scottish Rite. So, Schorst steals a copy, because they just had this hanging around for some reason. You're going to write all this up and you're just going to leave it sitting around for this guy to steal. Now, what kind of a master plan for world? If you can't even keep your master plan secret, you don't deserve to rule the world, I would argue. So he steals it, gives it to Glinka, who then gives it to her uncle or something, General Sukhotin, and that's how this copy is passed down. And Glinka, she then argues, maybe correctly, is the woman who gave the copy to Nilus. That may be very well. So I think there is this copy which is floating around. But notice again, the stories of its origins go back to France. So there, in the biggest nut, if you think not in a nutshell by any means, or it's an extremely big nut, is the very complex, rather mysterious, and still at least partially unanswered question about the origins of one of the most pervasive and destructive works of literature in modern history. It is still a turd on the plate, the origin of which is unknown.